All right. So let's get started. Today's conversation is going to be about sociological research methods. I'm sure that you read the chapter and looked at it. The chapter starts out with a discussion of the scientific method, which I assume you are all pretty familiar with from like 5th grade. What I like about methods, and it's actually the focus I take when I do a whole class on methods, is really what you're looking at is a question of philosophy. How do we know what we think we know? And I'm going to tell you, you don't actually know that much. Most of what you know comes from somebody else, which is fine, but in recognizing that, you recognize you're taking on faith what they've told you, right? Did anybody watch a State of the Union address last night? If you did, you probably watched it on TV, right? Were you there? Did you see Obama, right? I did not listen to the State of the Union address because I was stuck behind a backhoe on the road. Yeah, that's it. So if I listen to the commentators on Fox or NPR tell me what he said, not only did I not watch a recording of him, I'm actually taking somebody else's understanding of what he said, right? So there's two layers there. Even science, I hesitate to even bring this up because it's so problematic, but if you pay attention, there's this huge debate going on between whether or not vaccines are good for you or whether or not vaccines cause autism, right? And both sides are pretty certain they've got it sorted out, which is in fact part of the problem, right? So because we have applied ourselves scientifically to the problem of human diseases, we have almost eradicated some of the worst scourges of humankind, at least here in the West. And that's a wonderful thing, right? Now, along come a handful of hippies who say, I think these cause autism, right? And there are people who are distrustful of the modern world. There are people who are distrustful of authorities, which they should be, who then go with these guys and say, yeah, I think they're actually right. Okay? Now, in and of itself, that's fine. So far, we've got an honest discussion and debate going. And when somebody over here, that's my right, your left, right? When somebody over here says, well, this happened to my kid, and this happened to my kid, and this happened to my kid. I'm recording and it's beeping at me. That starts to add up and make convincing stories. Now, is it science? Well, it's the beginning of science, right? It's empirical evidence. It's this happened to me. Of course, it's anecdotal. We can't know at the general level based on a handful of individual people's stories. There's problems with that, most certainly, okay? So they tell their stories, and these people get on board. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. So these guys, there are weaknesses in their knowledge. They may or may not acknowledge those weaknesses, right? What they're dealing with is largely anecdotal, but that doesn't mean it's invalid. Over here, we've got the scientists who say anti-vaxxers are bullshitters, right? They say, look at all the statistical studies we have. Look at the problems that the anti-vaccine people are causing. And in fact, we are seeing some of these diseases pop up here and there because others aren't doing it. Okay, here's where I see a problem with this. You probably have an opinion on this. You probably think you know what the right answer is. I'm going to tell you we don't know what the right answer is on either side. Every single thing we're looking at on both of these has to do with a level of certainty, right? So are we certain we have gotten rid of a lot of these diseases? Absolutely, right? Are we certain there are no side effects? Well, what medical intervention doesn't have side effects? Absolutely none, right? So we have to say, well, okay, there might be some problems, but overall it's still a net positive, unless it's your kid, right? Point number 2, when we get in a fight with these guys, how many of us go back and actually find the studies? How many of us go and find out what the statistical tests were done? Yeah, we got one. What statistical tests were actually done to find out if there was a link and if there wasn't, right? And there have been statistical tests, and they usually come up fairly weak on links. But notice, fairly weak isn't no link, right? Now, okay, so we're presented with science that's like this, when actually it's maybe 2 notches lower than that. Instead of 100% certain, let's say, well, we're 95% certain. That's still pretty good. I'm still going to vaccinate my kids, but I'm being honest about how certain I am about this. Does that make sense? Now, furthermore, you know vaccination doesn't work all that well unless everybody's on board. They call it herd immunity. So if everybody gets vaccinated, then the disease is mostly gone. So the little kids who aren't vaccinated don't catch whooping cough, right? And the old people whose vaccinations have long since worn off and who are going to die if they get a cold, they don't get it either. Does that make sense? Okay. So if I'm a public official, it's actually in my interest to try and get you to vaccinate. Is that going to affect how I present the science to you? Do you think if I sell psychiatric medication, that's going to affect how I present the science to you? Absolutely. Now, are they lying? No, they're not lying. They might be spinning, but we're used to spin. We had the presidential speech last night. But if you don't actually know what the spin is, or you aren't able to say, we know this much, we know this much, we know this much, we know this much, if you're not able to even acknowledge how weak our understanding of a specific thing is, then you're going to have problems, okay? Now, my wife always picks on me for this. She says, because it turns me on, I always focus on the worst case scenario or on the shakiness of our knowledge in everyday life. And she's absolutely right. I get a huge kick out of it. I sometimes feel like a sophomore philosophy student. But do we really know? Right? The problem is we all have to live our lives regardless of what year in college we are and regardless of what our major is. Even sophomore philosophy students have to make educated guesses based on imperfect knowledge. In fact, you'll recognize that the whole game of life is making educated guesses in a world of imperfect knowledge. Does that make sense? Now, when you start to notice this and you start to listen, especially with the campaign season starting to heat up, you'll be able to see this everywhere you turn. Is the minimum wage going to hurt jobs? I don't know the answer to that, right? But I can bet that if I turn on the TV, someone's going to make the case that indeed raising minimum wage will hurt jobs. Someone else is going to make the case otherwise. Are they going to tell me how certain they are? Are they going to tell me whether or not people have done side-by-side county comparisons? No, that's boring. And believe me, it's boring. So we're just going to take their word for it, right? Anything in sociology, so here I am talking about epidemiology, which is a pretty good science. It's not physics, but it's not quite as bad as tornado science. Which trailer court is that tornado going to take out? It'd be nice to know, wouldn't it? Which warm front on a fall afternoon is going to create tornadoes that's going to take out that trailer court? It would be nice to know. Best we can say is there's a 50% chance of thunderstorms today, right? So, and I'm not picking on them. It's tough work. So here's tornado science, here's epidemiology, and here's physics. Is physics perfect? Actually, it's not. Pretty damn cool, but it's not perfect, right? So the stuff you think you know, gravity, well, how do you know? Well, aside from actually falling down at the theoretical level, I don't understand it. But I know that if I drop something, it's going to fall. And if I trip, I'm going to get hurt, right? I don't necessarily know everything I need to know about it, but in a world of imperfect knowledge, I can make decisions and keep from making a fool out of myself by falling off the stage. Does that make sense? So when I start talking about research methodology, you have to understand that in the back of my head, this is what we're doing. We're actually pursuing something almost philosophical, right? How do we know what we think we know? That's called epistemology in philosophy. And secondly, this ends up being accounting or economics or behavioral psych. How do we act in a world of imperfect knowledge? Okay? So that's what I was doing. So again, I'll take it that you've read the book, the app, and have a passing understanding with the scientific method. There will probably be test questions on that. But essentially, you're taking theory. It's number one, deductive reasoning. You're taking theory. You're seeing how it applies to your question. You're finding what gaps there are in the theory. Then you're going and you're looking at other people's research to do the background of literature to see what you need to know. And then you're devising a test. Well, then you build a hypothesis, then you devise a test, then you dunk, dunk, dunk. And if you come up with something good, well, then you backfill that into theory, right? So that your theory gets better. Inductive reasoning works the other way around. Inductive reasoning works from the bottom up. There's a couple of ways to apply this, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. The first is, do you ever hear anybody say, oh, there's people that are book smart and there's people that are street smart? Okay? The first thing I'm going to say is, I think that's a completely bogus distinction. Either you're smart, and there's a lot of different ways to be smart, or hopefully God gave you other talents. But when someone says a person is street smart, notice that what they're talking about is someone's got a lot of experience, right? And that experience is adding up into intelligence they can do something with. If there's theory there, it's based behind all of that empirical knowledge, okay? There's another way to understand this. If we go back a very long time, so long it doesn't matter how long, but say 120 to 150 years ago in the field of medicine, you end up with, you actually notice this distinction between med and nursing, but that's kind of a different thing. If we go back far enough, before medicine was as regulated as it is now, you had this interesting distinction, okay? You could go see an empiric, or you could go see a doctor, okay? Now, what is the difference between the two? And the answer is, the doctor is a person who had been to medical school. So, you're sick. Do you want to go to a fresh medical school graduate who has no clinical experience yet? Right? That's a person who's theory educated, but hasn't actually applied any of that theory yet. And they'll be able to give you a good theoretical guess as to what's wrong with you. Okay? You can go from the bottom up, though. The empiric was someone who mostly taught themselves, right? And mostly worked with just whatever worked. In today's world, that might be, say, a gym owner. All right, a gym owner starts life as a personal trainer. How do they learn to be a personal trainer? I have no idea. But they get a couple of fat people to lose some weight. They get a couple of people to get stronger. And do they care about the theory? No, they know that this worked for this guy, so they try it on the next one. And they try it on the next one. And then when something doesn't work with this guy, they try something else. And they just keep trying stuff until at some point they have a good body of knowledge. And they can say, look, if you come to my gym, and then they open their own shop, you come to my gym, I can help you get healthier. Based on what theory? Who cares about theory? Based on 1,000 clients over the last 5 years. Okay, that's great. Now you'll notice there's gaps in both of these approaches if they're taken independently, right? if your approach to things is theoretical, there's a lot of day-to-day stuff you just don't recognize, okay? And if your approach to everything is, well, this worked last time, you might have trouble putting together the theory, and you might have trouble seeing some of the bigger or more exotic gaps, if that makes sense. So science, and really all knowledge, but this is what makes Western science really powerful. Science is a give and take between the theoretical and the empirical, okay? There's one more example. Socrates, Aristotle. If we go back to the Greek philosophers, Socrates actually. If we go back to the Greek philosophers, they're really interesting. You read their books and they're sitting around speculating. And they're smart and they're very logical. So their speculation is pretty damn good. However, and sometimes the political commentators strike me this way, they thought their speculation was good enough. They didn't actually bother to go test those speculations against theory, right? So they figure this out, and then they say, we know these three things, so therefore we got to figure this out, we got to figure this out, we got to figure this out, right? They take their logical building blocks and they build it. But without actually comparing their their thoughts against empirical outcomes, then they don't know that block number 2 in that chain of reasoning is actually wrong. And if block number 2 in that chain of reasoning is wrong, what about block number 3? What about block number 40? Number 400, right? And the answer is, while the old-time philosophers are fun to read, when you start reading their scientific stuff, they sound ludicrous to the modern minds. I mean, it's kind of entertaining to think that this is what they actually thought. These are some of the smartest people in their world, and this is the way they thought the world worked. It's funny, it's humorous, but it does not pass for anything even remotely like our science, okay? So what makes our science special and effective is, yes, we theorize. Here's how I think it's going to work. And then we test it, right? And then after we test it, we try and take that new knowledge and reassemble it into a theory. That give and take, back and forth, is what tests for weaknesses, improves those weaknesses, and moves the theory forward. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. And so I'm always a little bit frustrated when textbooks give you this understanding of the scientific method, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because it's actually a recursive, meaning it goes round and round and round. The end here influences the beginning here, influences the end here. It's recursive and it builds upon itself. I also get a little bit frustrated when we present these two different kinds of knowledges as one is better than the other. Usually it's because someone has a vested interest, right? If I'm saying, there's street smarts and there's book smarts, well, chances are I didn't get a PhD, right? Because if you get a PhD, clearly you value book smarts. But that doesn't mean the book smart people are stupid at all, right? We just say they are on TV. And when book people say, whatever, that's all anecdotal, that's all, they're not going to say street smarts. But it's because they don't actually know how to rebuild the brakes, right? We can get some trained monkey to do that. I wish it wasn't true, but I've heard that. What does it take to rebuild the brakes? Is it something a trained monkey can do? Well, on one level, sure, in the same way that a neurosurgeon is sort of a trained monkey, right? Or an orthopod. I mean, what's complicated to a knee surgery compared to, the insides of your car? And the answer is, it's a pretty simple joint. A lot of ways to screw it up, and I want someone who knows what they're doing working on it. But if the mechanic is a trained monkey, no offense to the orthos, but they're trained monkeys too, okay? So we really need to recognize this back and forth. Pretending that one wins means you've lost already, okay? So let's move to the next one. Okay, this one I think is kind of important too. Another place where you see people go wrong with science is, well, it's not the same question. Well, screw it. Let's start a different direction. Do scientists believe in Bigfoot? It's actually kind of a loaded question, right? First of all, what should a scientist believe in? The right answer to that question is nothing. Why? Because science is about evidence. A scientist should say the preponderance of evidence is that Bigfoot doesn't exist. To say I don't believe in Bigfoots is to say, where do we use believe? Usually we use the term believe in religion, and religion and science aren't the same thing. Well, on one hand they are. They're both trying to get at what the capital T truth is. But their method is different, right? When you go to church and they talk about your faith, what does faith mean? Faith means it's something I believe without empirical evidence, right? If I was going to be a smartass, I would say, if you go around, this is if I were a smartass, which clearly I'm not. If you go around saying, I hope God cures Chris's heart attacks, right? You're actually being kind of weak in your faith, aren't you? Notice what you're doing is looking for empirical evidence for your beliefs. Then they're not beliefs. Then it's preponderance of evidence. Then you're doing science, right? And I don't believe the mustard seed piece of the Bible was about the preponderance of evidence, right? So a scientist should never say, I believe in ghosts or I don't believe in ghosts. Now, scientists are human, just like everybody, so they say crap like this all the time. But if you actually nail them down on it, they should be open to proof of ghosts. They should be open to proof of Bigfoots. They should be open to proof of God, right? They should be open to proof of aliens. These are all things that good scientific people, say they don't believe in. Why? Because it seems silly out there. We don't have evidence of it. All right? There's a particular epistemological / psychological problem here. I don't know the name because screw it, I don't do psych. But what the problem is absence of evidence does not imply evidence of absence. Okay? I haven't seen a Bigfoot. Therefore, Bigfoot doesn't exist, right? There's an absence of evidence for me of Bigfoot, but there's that. You know what else I haven't seen? Alabama. I don't think Alabama exists. I've seen Canada, so I know it's there, but not Alabama, right? So is that a fair assumption? Because I haven't seen it, it doesn't actually exist? And the answer is, of course, it's not a fair assumption. But when someone says there's no Bigfoots, there's no aliens, you'll notice it's sort of the same problem, okay? Now that problem is, let me go to the flip side of that, and then we'll look at this. The flip side of that are the conspiracy theory dudes. And ghosts. Did I mention ghosts? You got to have ghosts in there. The conspiracy theory dudes are an absolute hoot. The conspiracy theory dudes, instead of saying, I haven't seen it, so therefore it doesn't exist, that's also summed up in the turkey problem. Perhaps you've heard this. So it works for any farm animal, but let's go with turkeys. Every day, turkey's born every day. Farmer comes out, throws some grain at 5. Turkey has a good life. Farmer's friendly to him, throws him some grain at 5. This goes on for months. Maybe it goes on for a couple of years. The turkey, of course, knows with every fiber of his being that the farmer's his best friend you know? Now, the wise old horses live long enough that they could see how these things go. The horse says to the turkey, dude, I don't think you should take for granted that the farmer loves you. Turkey's like, dude, farmer's my bestie. We go way back. He feeds me every day at 5. How could he be a bad dude, right? And then, the day before Thanksgiving, farmer's over there in the corner sharpening his axe. He's just doing chores. Turkey doesn't know. Horse just shakes his head. Right? So saying you don't believe in Bigfoot, you don't believe in aliens, you don't believe in, Loch Ness Monster, is equivalent to saying, yeah, the farmer loves me, feeds me every day at 5. All the evidence I've ever witnessed shows me he's going to be good that way. Okay? Now, here's the flip side. It doesn't really matter which one we want to use. Let's go with, I don't know which one to go with. Let's go with 9/11, all right? So 9/11 was big, it was ugly, it was traumatic, it was a mess. It was big, ugly, traumatic mess. And it was big, and it was traumatic. And it was ugly. So there are people out there who will tell you that 9/11 was not actually done by a bunch of disgruntled Afghanis who wanted to bring down America because they hate us for our freedom. Right? So who actually did it? Well, this gets to be an interesting question, because if we listen to the conspiracy theorists, they're going to tell us, maybe it was the government. Maybe, let's go with the government because we don't got all day. So maybe it was the government, all right? Now, what do they base this on, all right? If you go out on the internet, you'll find everything you need to get a kick to study this. The most entertaining video that I'm aware of is the loose change video, freely available on YouTube. And they'll list all of these problems with the straight up story that we get from the government on what 9/11 was, right? They'll tell you, number one, that that the strike was coincided with a day that there was also supposed to be a mock airstrike against the United States. So the U.S. government didn't, our military didn't immediately know we were under attack, right? Buying them a crucial extra few minutes. They'll tell you it looks an awful lot like the buildings were demolished by absolute professionals. Like, there's a lot of ways to screw up a building demolition. And screwing up 2 of the tallest buildings in New York would have meant the buildings fell over horizontally and smashed tremendous amounts in New York, which we don't want, right? If we're the bad guys, we just want to take out the buildings. So they are perfectly controlled demolition, right? They'll talk about some of the chemicals that shouldn't have been there, that were found there, that shows, I don't know, blah, 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 explosives and all this stuff. There's some really cool ones about the Pentagon. This one's actually fun. So, big ass jumbo liner smashes into the Pentagon, right? And what's left? Well, nothing's left, which isn't surprising because it's basically a pop can with engines, right? So it's completely shredded, and the Pentagon's got a hole that looks like an armor-piercing cruise missile or something. Okay. Now, maybe some of this is true stuff. Do I know? I'm watching conspiracy crap on the YouTube. What do I know, right? Can I take any of it for granted? No, it's conspiracy crap on YouTube. Obviously, I can't take it for granted. But even if we said, right, so like my confidence on this is about 3%. But even if we say, all right, I'll give you that for the moment, this looks weird, all right? To jump to the conclusion that this was an inside job, that George Bush was involved, that it was a false flag operation to get the United States into the Middle East, right? Notice essentially what these guys are doing is, what's the connect the dots book? They're connecting the dots. Here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot. It draws this conspiracy theory. I always got a kick out of the constellations. I'm terrible at them. I have no idea what they are. Part of the problem is I look up and I see 3 stars in a triangle, and lo and behold, that's supposed to be 14 fishes leaping through the hoop held up by a circus elephant, right? I don't see it, right? I see 3 stars in a triangle. So essentially, conspiracy theorists are going the other way. They're taking the 3 stars, which really, all we can say for certain, if we're going to grant that they might be correct, is that, yeah, that's weird. And you know what humans don't like? We don't like accepting that we don't know. I don't know what it is, we hate it. If I said, is there a God? Don't answer that. 90% of you are going to say there is or there isn't. Very few of you are going to say, yeah, that's a tough question. There's not really evidence either way. I don't actually know. No, we don't like it. We don't like it at all, right? So when we say 9/11 was ugly, a lot of people died. I hated going to Manhattan and smelling the smoke and seeing smelling the concrete dust and seeing the hole in lower Manhattan, right? But that's all I know. We want a bad guy. And we want good guys to go solve the bad guy's problem. And if we have to, we'll make our government into our own bad guys. Does this mean trust the government? Absolutely not. But again, that's a very, right, these guys are constructing almost fairy tales out of very little information. Yeah, we have this piece of evidence, this piece of evidence, and this piece of evidence, and now they have 14 fish leaping through the hoop held by a circus elephant. Okay? These guys over here are essentially going, science! What? No, that's crazy. Science! Well, okay, turkey. Science tells you you're safe at 5 o'clock. Science, it's not that science couldn't tell you that the turkey's in trouble getting on Thanksgiving. It's that turkey's experience, right, isn't big enough for even the best science to actually help him out, right? Even science applied only gives this turkey enough knowledge to know most times I get food at 5. Now he could ask someone else, but he's got to take the horse's word for it. How much likelihood are you going to give to the horse? If you're the turkey and what the horse is telling you is completely against everything that you've experienced, you're going to say, the horse is old and crazy. We say that about old people, don't we? The horse is old and crazy. I give him about 8%. Well, turkey, it's awesome, isn't it? Okay, so, turkey dinner. So the way that I frame this is that, again, just like if you try and approach science from only a deductive perspective or only an inductive bottom-up perspective, you're not going to get that proper recursive nature that makes science what it is, right? You're going to get one or you're going to get the other, and they're both flawed, okay? In the same way, you can't be so critical that you're not open to new and novel interpretations, right? You can't be so critical that a Bigfoot is an impossibility. But you can't be so creative that a Bigfoot is a certainty. I found some hair on the back fence. Obviously, it's a Bigfoot roaming around Warner Robins, right? Obviously. Clearly. You have to go back and forth. And, I'm using Bigfoot and I'm using ghosts as an example of this, but we don't have to go that far. We can go to Einstein. Einstein still blows my mind, right? Einstein's faced with a very specific problem. How is it that motion is relative, right? If I stand on a flatbed truck going that way, 35 miles an hour, and I throw a baseball 35 miles an hour, because I got that arm, then that baseball is going 70 miles an hour compared to something on the ground, right? And if I stand at the front of the truck and throw it backwards, then that baseball's stationary relative to the ground. Everybody understands that? That's easy. What happens if I take a little cat laser, the one you psych the cats out with, and shoot it from the back of the truck? Does it go the speed of light plus 35 miles an hour? No, it goes the speed of light, okay? If I shine it from the front of the truck going backwards, does it go the speed of light minus 35 miles an hour? No, it goes the speed of light, right? This is a simple triangulation problem. Of all the possible answers, it's been 100 years since Einstein, I still cannot wrap my mind around space-time being flexible, right? The universe is actually bending around that laser. Whatever the hell that means, the universe is bending around that laser, right? Yeti, as a hypothesis, as a maybe, doesn't hold a candle to the universe bends around the laser. Ghosts are more likely than the universe bending around the laser, right? And yet we still haven't disproven that. It's mind-blowing, okay? But then at the same time, we have to critique it. So you got this new idea. You think you've got an explanation, right? It's up to you, if you're honest, and it's up to your enemies, if you're not, to try and tear the living shiza out of that new idea. So I guarantee you the other scientists in Einstein's time were like, dude, whatever, space-time's flexible, my ass, right? Go ahead.
What is the speed of light?
I don't actually remember.
It's a ridiculous number if I'm not mistaken.
It is?
It's like millions of miles an hour or something like that.
186,000 miles per second.
Very good. There we go. 186,000 miles per second.
Per second.
Per second.
So how can you tell if it's not 35 miles an hour slow?
They set it up with like long distance mirrors, actually, even in Einstein's era. So they set up these mirrors that are like miles apart. They zing things and they're timing it that way. That's my understanding, but I could be wrong.
And that's how they can tell that it wasn't 35 miles an hour faster
I guess so.
or slower.
You got to look it up.
I think it's all part of the sleeping pill theory.
What's your sleeping pill theory?
People sleep better at night believing that there is a God, believing that 9/11 happened, believing that man walked on the moon.
Yeah, you're actually treading very, very close to some hardcore existential philosophy there. There's a line from Nietzsche. Yes, Nietzsche. He says, how does it go? Beware when you look into the abyss, because if you look long enough, the abyss stares back, okay? So if you take what I just said, and what Cecil is saying here, with, you honestly assume it's true, how do we know there's a God, right? Well, the answer is we don't. We have faith that there is one. We believe in a God without the evidence. The flip side of that is, I believe all sorts of shit that's wrong. What if I'm wrong about that? Right? The idea that I might not get to see my grandmother that died last year ever again, the idea that I might not get to see my girlfriend from freshman year of college ever again, no, not like ever, capital E ever, right? That's terrifying. And it is even more terrifying if truly the universe goes on billions and billions and billions of miles. If in fact what rules out aliens is nothing sentient could possibly cross that distance, if in fact the mere act of trying to see the other side of the universe with our telescopes is distorted by the fact that we're looking at light that's older than human civilization. I mean, it might all be gone and we don't have any idea, right? That's really terrifying. okay? But that's terrifying at a God level. Do you trust the government? Well, it's an interesting problem. In political era like this, people are going to line up on either side of this, right? And they're going to say, oh, the government's good, we should do this. They're going to say, oh, the government's bad, we should do that. Well, it's hard to know exactly what our government's up to right now, but we know through Freedom of Information Acts what the government was up to 25, 30 years ago. And you know what? It wasn't actually pretty, right? Our governments are some of the ones that seeded some of the violence of the civil rights era. Wait, it wasn't blacks rioting in the inner city? Oh, well, it was that too, but it was also government plants trying to cause violence so that they'd have an excuse to kill the leaders. Oh, the government doesn't do that. Yeah, no, the government doesn't do that. Right? We celebrate Christopher Columbus Day. You know, we have Indian names all over everything. It's a good thing we don't like Hitler, because it was really wrong of him to try and clear the land east of Germany of those inferior Eastern Russians and Jews. Well, they'd be Western Russians, Eastern Europeans, and Jews, to fill it up with good Aryans. So they moved out a bunch of dark people and put in a bunch of white, blue-eyed people. Well, does that sound like westward expansion of the United States? Well, see, when you start pulling apart these myths, and I don't mean untruths, but I mean the fundamental narratives we tell ourselves, the sleeping pill, we don't like it one bit, right? Servicemen are heroes. What about when we hear about some of the really, not just bad, but evil shit that our servicemen do in our name? Does that make you feel better? We just ignore it, right? I love America, right? Go America. The truth is, I do like my home country, but I'm not blind to some of what's happened. Most of us, really, for whatever reason, don't want to think about some of the negative stuff our country's done. It's harder to say, this is me, this is us, we're flawed, and we're going to own that, than it is to say, yeah, America, right? And it's going to be, I mean, it's, when you start, and this is why I say this is existential and it's Nietzschean, when you take that ruthless criticism to say, how do I know about my church? How do I know about God? How do I know about my country? How do I know about my family? Has your family ever done anything that's truly unacceptable? No comment. How do I, right? And you go on down the line, you'll recognize, just like I started this class talking about, we're making our decision based on imperfect knowledge. You'll recognize we actually live in a world of narrative, storytelling, all of which covers, sort of papers over the reality that we don't know and we're not that good, but we have these stories we tell ourselves and we tell our children, right? That's why being a child is wonderful. You're not here if you're 12 years old. 12 sort of sucks because you find out there's no Easter Bunny, there's no Santa Claus. Yes, your mom sometimes lies, right? But when you're 6, you're the turkey. And it's pleasant being the turkey. Some people spend their whole life wanting to not know, right? Ignorance is bliss. And if you doubt the truth of what I'm saying, notice the story that the Western Bible opens with, right? Now, you don't have to be religious to recognize the importance of the foundational document of all of the Western religions, and hence, deeply important to Western culture, right? The whole story is about Adam and Eve going from being the turkey to being the adult. Oh shit. It's actually really challenging. I mean, I love it. And that's where you're kind of headed with that. And that's on one level, it's a whole different conversation. But I think you're kind of right. Okay, so hopefully this kind of makes sense then. You can come up with a new theory, and it might be right, but it's up to your enemies in your discipline to try and tear it down. And that's what they're going to do. You know why we have relativity theory? It's not because it's so awesome. It's not because Einstein proved anything. It's because all of Einstein's haters have failed to disprove it. And this is a fundamental thing in science. When we talk as if we prove things. Regular people do, scientists do. We use this kind of language all the time. We've proved vitamin C stops colds. That's actually not, that doesn't hold up, but we've proved this. No. I tried it, it worked. So I think it's a thing. You think I'm crazy. You test it, and it doesn't fly. So I have to say, well, it doesn't work like I thought. Time to go back to the theory drawing board, right? So science progresses, not because we find out new stuff and add it, but because we find out new stuff, throw it on, and the wrong stuff gets pulled away, right? So we can have, well, last example, and then I'll move to the next slide. Man, the day's going fast. Okay. The ghost shows on TV. They're deeply entertaining and probably mostly wrong. And in fact, the Mormon guy got busted, didn't he? What am I thinking of? I'm thinking of ghost hunters. And this is all right, like the ghost thing is like 10 years old, so it's not even current anymore. But so they have these ghost shows on TV. Everybody knows that. The Ghost Hunters Taps, that's it. And it had the fat guy, who I kind of liked because whatever. And they had the skinny guy, and they both were plumbers. And the way this show worked, and it's much less entertaining than some of the others. And you got to remember, I have kids that like horror stories, so I get to see all this crap. It was much less entertaining because the other ones are like, ooh, this place is haunted. I heard a noise, right? And the Taps guys, they go, oh, we heard a noise. All right, let's go see. Are the windows open? Is there a draft? Is the temperature changing outside so that the house is creaking? I need you to go upstairs and stomp around and see if we can remake that noise. Notice what they're actually doing. And I think the success eventually killed them because they had to make stuff up at some point. But notice what they're actually doing. Instead of saying, here's some evidence, bam, there's ghosts, which is what all of us do all the time. They're saying, here's some evidence, let's see if we can disprove it, right? And they'll disprove and disprove and disprove and disprove and disprove. And the reason the show, even though it's much less scary, much less spooky, much less entertaining, but the reason the show worked was because after they got done, they'd say, well, you know, we got rid of this, we disproved this noise, it was the pipes, and this, you know, there's a draft blowing in the window and this. But you know, the weirdest thing is, we had this on the videotape, and we haven't been able to reproduce it. We haven't been able to disprove this thing we found, right? Now, did they prove ghosts? No, they disproved the absence of this and this and this, right? By disproving by failing to disprove, notice that's a double negative, they accidentally sort of small p proved. At least until someone comes along and says, no, we found this is the problem, right? And then it'll go away. And so that was kind of fun. I have to say that I was teaching in Gettysburg when those shows were popular, and Gettysburg is like the friggin' hauntedest town in most of the country. And like it's a little funny saying it here, but honestly, there, you bump into someone in town, there's a 3/4 chance they believe in ghosts because the town is what it is. Okay. How much of this do I have? All right. So, most sociology, social science research can fall into two categories. One is quantitative and the other is qualitative. The quantitative is the numbers side. And it looks more scientific which doesn't mean the other isn't science, it just doesn't, it's a little bit harder. It's more like meteorology. And you've already bumped into it a zillion times because you've taken surveys. Now, some surveys are crap, but a lot of surveys are actually real attempts to gather information, okay? In today's world, however, you are studied much more than you think you are, and way more than any surveys you actually fill out, because today's world operates on big data. So you sit and you cruise Facebook, you cruise Instagram, which, right, is also owned by Facebook, and they're paying attention not just to what you click that you like and you dislike, which all goes into a big database somewhere, but how long you stay on this article, how long you stay on this article, and they're drawing correlations, which would really blow your mind, because when I read about it, I'm thinking, oh my goodness. They're guessing, what beer you like and political affiliation and personality traits based on liking this and this and this, none of which are connected. But these three things act as a predictor for this thing over here, and this thing over here is what they can sell. All right? Now, the focus for quantitative is never actually that deep. I don't get to understand how you feel about your parents' divorce with quantitative research. In fact, I kind of don't care what you feel about your parents' divorce, right? I'll say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how happy or unhappy were you with your parents' divorce? And you say 5, very unhappy, or you say 1, very happy. That's it, right? That doesn't tell me much, it just gives me something to go on. More important than the depth, when we're talking about quantitative data, is the breadth, right? The width of that data. Because we want to be able to generalize to a large group of people. As it says at the bottom, how do we know something about Americans without talking to all 300 million of us? And the answer has everything to do with sampling, okay? So when you start to talk, and this is probably the most important piece of this, when you start to talk about how to understand something like that, there's two layers. There's the population and the sample. The population is the group about whom you want to say something. So if we're talking about Americans, it's all 300 million of us. If we're talking about Middle Georgia State students, it's these 5,000 or 6,000 of us, right? It's everybody who fits in there. Now, we're not going to talk to all 300 million Americans. We're not going to talk to all 6,000 Middle Georgia State students. What we're going to do is we're going to take a small group, that's our sample, and ideally, to do it most scientifically, we want to make sure it's a random sample. Now, the random sample, all it means on its face is that everybody has the same chance of being chosen, okay? So, if there are 5,000 Middle Georgia State students, MGA students, and if we're going to sample 500, that means every single person has a 1 in 10 chance of being chosen. There are some specific things about how you set up your population so that works out. There are ways to do that properly, but if people have different chances of being chosen, that introduces bias into your sample so that when you try and say something about your population, you're actually going to be wrong, right? I'm trying to think of a couple examples. So you all know the colleges operate, including ours, a lot on donations, gift giving. Like, you pay tuition, the state gives us money, and we still go out and we ask for money to help operate things, right? So let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that the president's office or the development office has a list of the 100 richest families whose children or family members attend MGA. As a matter of fact, I have faith with about 80% probability such a list exists, just because that's how colleges work. Okay, I've not seen it. I have no evidence. It's faith. I believe. All right. If we say, my goodness, we need to talk to some students about whatever, and we go to that list, and we take 50 students off of that list and start asking them about financial aid, because that's the list we had. Notice how wrong we are going to be when it comes to saying something about financial aid and Middle Georgia State students, right? We'd be so wrong, it would be almost ridiculous. Except that those problems end up being a little bit easier to bump into than you actually think. Yeah, that's a good example. Now, if we draw the sample correctly, okay, and there's some, I didn't bring my markers. There's some math in this which I don't know off the top of my head. I get it out of a book, so you're just going to have to trust me. You're going to have faith in what I'm telling you, right? That when you take samples of a population and so the population curve on whatever it is you want to measure goes like this. When you take samples of that population and take all of the possible samples, which ends up being way more instances than the actual population, it works out mathematically, but trust me, your possibility for what your answer is on the mean is closer and tighter to the mean for the population than the spread in the population is. You know what? Maybe never mind. Because, doing curves like this doesn't actually make a ton of sense, and it's going to require a lot of explanation. But the short answer, if there are 100 people in the population and you want to draw a sample of 10, there's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then 1 through 9 plus 11, 1 through 9 plus 12, right? There end up being several thousand possibilities, ways to slice out that group of 10, and that sample of 10 from that population of 100, and when we plot all those means out, they end up really tight around the population curve. And that's why we can do this. But if your sampling isn't correct, then you can't make that assumption. And even worse than there being bias in your sampling that you're aware of is bias in your sampling that you're not aware of, right? Okay, so that's the quantitative part. The qualitative part is asking how people feel about a thing, right? That question about how you think of your parents' divorce is a real question. And those of you who have divorced parents, those of you who have been through a divorce, if we sat down, I could easily get an hour conversation out of you about what it meant for you, what it meant for your kids, what it meant for your partner, what it's meant for your personal life, why it was the right thing to do, even though there were negative fallout from it, right? If you're asking about the things that matter in people's lives, there's a lot of meaning attached to this. Now, just for a moment, go back to last week. When I was talking about meaning, I was actually talking about symbolic interaction, right? A whole theoretical branch of sociology tries to understand human meaning. And when we're doing this interpretive or this qualitative stuff, that human meaning is actually what we are interested in, okay? Now, the problem, well, not the problem, but one of the problems you're going to bump into if you do qualitative work is it is inherently not generalizable, right? So if I sit down and I pick 10 of you in class and we sit and we talk an hour about your experience with divorce, either your own or your parents, notice we didn't have this conversation with people who weren't divorced. We had an hour-long conversation. Did we follow the exact same survey? No, you can't. By default, an interpretive thing is exploratory, right? You can't ask the same questions the same way. And even when you answer it, right? A survey works because you ask everybody the same question and you give them the same set of choices. Were you very unhappy, unhappy, didn't care, happy, very happy, right? But as soon as I ask two of you, even if you're both very unhappy with your divorce, right? The way that conversation goes is not going to be like, oh, look, they both hit 5 on a Likert scale. And if both of you are very happy with your divorce, again, it's not going to be something that's generalizable. We can't say divorced people feel like this. We could, if we built a survey, right, that was the same for everybody, if we found a good population that we're going to talk about, we built a good sampling frame, built a good sample, then we could say something about divorce, right? You got to structure it a different way. So with social research, you're always balancing off depth, understanding, right, versus breadth, generalizability. So what I have up there, IDIs, TDIs, focus groups. IDIs are in-depth interviews. TDIs are telephone depth interviews. Focus groups are where you get, I think you guys know focus groups. You get 6 or 8 people sitting around a table and you guide a conversation about whatever it is you're talking about. Marketing uses that one a lot. Participant observation is where you sit and you watch how people do things, right? Now again, this is in the field. You've got one researcher who is watching the people in one location. So you can say, here's how people act here, right? The way to get generalizability is you got to have a lot of researchers in a lot of different places, right? And by the time you do that, you start to lose that depth. And ethnography is, participant observation is when you do the thing that you're actually studying. And ethnography comes from the old anthropologists, ethnic, right? Ethnic group. You go and you study a group of people till you know everything you need to know about them, all right? Well, let me throw a couple of examples out. And these are the most extreme, the participant observation and ethnography. So ethnography is a big thing, and participant observation is one component of ethnography. There was a person that studied, this one's a really old study, but a person that studied punkers in Austin, Texas, right? Now, punk was its own movement back in like the 80s, and it was cool, right? You know how the Ataris had that song, the Don Henley cover? I saw a black flag sticker on a Cadillac, right? Which was, anyway. Okay, so punk was a thing back in the 80s. Austin is a very funky, cool town. Most people will tell you it's like Texas, but not like Texas. But still, a punk scene in Austin is a little bit weird, right? And so this person would go to the punk club. I think it was Tuesday night was the punk shows. She would go to the punk club and she would hang out with the punkers, right? Because what she wanted to know was, what are you doing? What does this mean to you, right? And she went to the shows. I don't know if she did her hair or not. She hung out with them. She made friends with them. And at the end, she even like participated in some off-site activities, probably not legal. And when she was done, she was able to say, when you start to look at the punkers in this environment, you've got the hardcores. They're the ones that tattoo up their face and are so committed to the movement that they actually sacrifice their outside life for it, right? Because by the time you tattoo black flag on your forehead, there goes your shot in an accounting job, right? And then you have the softcores, and they're the ones who are pretty into it, but they're not willing to compromise their external identity, right? So their tattoos are up high. Or, you know, you could always cover them up with sleeves. And their hair might stick up like this on the weekend, but it can be laid down for your boring job, right? They're still in the scene. And then there were the posers. I don't remember the name she had for them, but every subgroup has posers, right? And the posers, they were wanting to be a little bit too hard they were trying too hard. And then there were the outside observers who were like pro-punk, they were cool, but they weren't, they were just appreciative observers. Now you'll notice that that's actually a really easy model to apply to other groups of whatever subculture it is you want to talk about. But what matters here is after hanging out with these guys for however many months, however many Tuesday nights, she could actually say, this is what the music means. This is what the people who are involved in the scene think of it. This is how, this is what they mean when they do these things. If they go out and they do acts of illegal acts of public I think it was public property destruction, probably smashing park benches with their skateboards, whatever. This is the reason that they do this. Like, she can actually tell you what punk means to them. Now notice, that took an awful lot of time, and she can't say anything about what riding a Harley means. But you know that riding a Harley means something important to Harley riders, right? And if you can afford a snazzy car, there's a reason you buy a BMW, right? It's the driving experience. And if you sit down and you talk with Beamer owners, they actually buy that shtick, right? Point being, you need to get that interpretive stuff to get a sense of what things mean to people, right? Now, you can use that interpretive stuff to inform your quantitative stuff. This is how marketing for Harley, Beamer, Merc, and every other thing you can imagine works. You can also use your quantitative stuff to identify anomalies, right? And then go do a deep dive there to find out what's happening. So when we worked on a project in Pennsylvania for the hospital there, these guys, they wanted to survey, find out what people needed from a hospital, right? One of the problems is, and this is going to sound a little bit familiar because agricultural areas are very similar. One of the problems was there was this huge migrant Mexican population, not just Hispanic, but honestly Mexican, right? And they worked in the orchards because it was Musselman's applesauce is from there, right? They have apple orchards all over the place. So the hospital, as a real serious problem, needs to talk to absolutely everybody. So we put together a survey, and there's no way to get a hold of these guys. They're migrants. If you don't have a list of their cell phone numbers, you can't call them on the phone. If you don't know where they live, you can't pass out flyers. There was no way to get a hold of them, right? Or, weirdly enough, in that neighborhood, in that county, the census said the population, the black population, you're going to love this, was 1%, which means I think they all lived like in the duplex next to me, because 1%, are you kidding me, right? But here's the thing, you can do your survey, right? And if you're doing a survey of 1,000 people, if you don't get 10 black people, you don't have that 1%. Now, you can't leave out the black people, can you? Right? So you need to go and actually find those guys and talk to them to find out what their problems are, right? There's qual filling in a gap in a quant survey. So they can go back and forth, and they should go back and forth if you're doing it right. Okay. How are we doing so far? Comments, questions, reaction, rebuttal, editorial, reply? All right. Thank you very much. That was actually kind of fun. And I'll see you on Monday.